What if everything you were told about the four Gospels is missing the point? Why would one story about Jesus Christ need four completely different accounts written across generations? If truth is clear, why does it arrive through multiple voices instead? And here is the uncomfortable question most people avoid asking themselves today. What if the differences are not a problem, but the entire design? Because what you are about to uncover is not contradiction at all. It is precision, intention, and something far more sophisticated than expected. Most people assume four Gospels exist because history was messy and inconsistent. But that assumption collapses the moment you actually examine them closely. These are not four competing stories trying to describe the same events. They are four perspectives intentionally crafted to reveal one complete reality. And once you see how they align, everything starts making sense differently. Now think about how you understand anything complex in your own life. You do not rely on one angle, one voice, or one interpretation alone. You look from different perspectives until the picture becomes clearer. Because depth never comes from simplicity, it comes from layered understanding. And that is exactly what is happening here in a powerful way. These four accounts function like four lenses focused on the same subject. Each lens reveals something the others cannot fully capture by itself. Remove one, and something essential disappears from your understanding immediately. Keep all four, and the image becomes sharper, deeper, and more complete. Now here is where the shift begins happening inside your thinking. Because the question is no longer why there are four accounts. The question becomes what each one is trying to show you specifically. And once you start asking that, everything begins opening up differently. Because each account was written with a specific audience in mind. And that audience shaped how the story was told and emphasized. One writer speaks to people rooted deeply in ancient tradition and prophecy. Another speaks to people who value action, speed, and visible results. Another speaks to those who feel excluded, overlooked, or pushed aside. And the last speaks to those asking the deepest question of all. Not what happened, but who this person truly is beyond appearances. Now pause and consider how intentional that structure really is. Because it means the story was never meant to be one-dimensional. It was designed to meet people exactly where they already are. And that is why it continues to resonate across cultures and generations. Because no matter where someone stands, one perspective speaks directly to them. Now here is the part that makes this even more fascinating. These perspectives do not contradict. They overlap and reinforce each other, like layers of evidence building toward a single, undeniable conclusion. And the more you examine them together, the stronger that conclusion becomes. Now think about how your brain processes information under uncertainty naturally. When multiple independent sources align, trust begins increasing automatically over time. This is called convergence, and it strengthens belief through consistent reinforcement. And that principle is embedded deeply within the structure of these accounts. Each one adds detail, context, and depth without breaking the core message. That creates a balance between repetition and variation that keeps attention engaged. Because too much repetition leads to boredom, and too much variation creates confusion. But this structure sits perfectly between those two extremes with precision. Now, here is where the emotional layer begins quietly entering the story. Because this is not just about information, it is about personal relevance. Each perspective answers a question people still ask themselves today constantly. Is there authority behind this story? Or is it just another idea? What actually happened? And does it matter in real-life situations? Does this story include people like me? or does it exclude them? And finally, is this just history, or does it redefine reality itself? Now notice how those questions move from external to deeply personal. They begin with curiosity and end with identity and belief. And that progression is not random. It is carefully structured for impact. Because transformation does not happen through information alone, it requires engagement. And engagement happens when a story begins intersecting with your own life. Now imagine if all of this had been reduced into one simple account. One voice, one tone, one perspective, trying to explain everything alone. It would lose depth, complexity, and the ability to connect broadly, because no single voice can capture something this large completely. And that is why these four accounts were never merged together. They were preserved separately to maintain their unique perspectives and strengths. Now, here's where curiosity should begin increasing inside you naturally. Because if each account reveals something unique, what are you missing now? What detail, what angle, what insight have you overlooked completely before? And more importantly, what happens when you finally see them together? Because that is where the full picture begins to emerge clearly. Now, stay with this, because the first account feels almost surprising. It does not begin with action, drama, or anything visually exciting. It begins with a list, a sequence of names connecting generations together. And to most modern readers, that feels irrelevant and easy to skip. But hidden inside that list is a claim that changes everything. Because before showing what this man does, it establishes who he is. And once that identity is clear, every action takes on new meaning. So the story does not start where you expect it to start. It starts where it needs to start to build understanding correctly. And that choice alone reveals how intentional this structure really is. Because nothing here is accidental. Everything serves a specific purpose. Now, here is the question you should be asking at this point. If the beginning feels this deliberate, what else have you missed? Because what comes next does not just continue the story forward. It begins building a case that challenges everything people thought they knew. And once that case starts unfolding, it becomes harder to ignore. And this is where the first account quietly reveals something most people miss. The Gospel of Matthew does not begin like any modern story you expect. It opens with a genealogy, a list of names most people skip instantly. But what looks boring is actually a deliberate and strategic opening move. Because Matthew is not telling a story first, he is making a claim. And that claim is aimed directly at a very specific audience. He is writing to people who measure truth through lineage, covenant, and prophecy. People who believe history is not random, but guided by divine promises. So he begins with two names that change everything for them. Abraham, the origin of their identity, and David, the symbol of kingship. That pairing is not accidental. It is a calculated declaration of authority. Matthew is saying this man stands at the center of both promises. He is the fulfillment of a story that began long before his birth. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Matthew keeps connecting events in this life to ancient prophetic writings. Over and over again, the same phrase quietly builds undeniable momentum. This happened so that what was spoken might be fulfilled completely. It appears again and again and again, forming a consistent structure. Almost like a legal case being presented before a skeptical audience. Every detail becomes evidence. Every moment becomes part of a larger design. And the effect is psychological as much as it is theological. Because repetition builds credibility, and credibility builds belief over time. Now here is where the tension begins to deepen in a powerful way. The very people waiting for this promised king fail to recognize him. The expectations they carried shaped what they were willing to accept. They wanted power, dominance, visible control, and immediate national restoration. But what they saw instead did not match their imagined expectations. And that mismatch created resistance, doubt, and eventually outright rejection. Now pause and consider what that means at a deeper level. Because this is not just about them, it reflects something in us. We often reject truth not because it lacks evidence or clarity, but because it does not match the version we expected to see. And Matthew understands this tension better than most people realize. Because the man writing this was once rejected by his own society. A tax collector viewed as a traitor, excluded from his own people. And yet, he becomes the one presenting the strongest case for their king. There is something profoundly personal embedded within this narrative structure. A rejected man writing about a rejected king to a rejecting audience. That emotional layer adds weight far beyond historical documentation alone, and it quietly reinforces one of the strongest psychological hooks in storytelling. People are drawn to stories of rejection followed by unexpected purpose. Now, as Matthew continues, something else begins to emerge clearly. This king does not behave like any king the world has seen. He speaks of humility, mercy, and a kingdom built on inner transformation. In a culture obsessed with status, he elevates the overlooked and ignored. The poor in spirit, the mourning, the meek become central figures. That is not just teaching, it is a radical redefinition of power. And here is where the narrative shifts from identity to mission. Because a king does not simply arrive, he establishes and expands influence. So Matthew moves toward a moment that carries global implications forward. Authority is declared, not partially, but completely, across heaven and earth. And then comes the command that extends far beyond one nation. Go, teach, reach all nations. Carry this message into every culture. What began with a Jewish genealogy now explodes into a global mission. And suddenly, the scope of this story becomes impossible to contain. It is no longer about one people, one place, or one moment. It becomes a movement designed to spread across the entire world. And that shift forces a deeper question into the mind of the viewer. If this claim is true, then where do you stand within it? Because this is not just history, it is an invitation to respond. And before you can even process that fully, the next account accelerates everything. Because the story you just saw carefully built now suddenly starts moving fast. And just when you expect the story to slow down and explain, the Gospel of Mark does something completely different from the beginning. There is no birth narrative, no background, no gentle introduction to follow. It opens like a scene already in motion, urgent and impossible to pause. A voice cries in the wilderness, preparing the way without hesitation. And immediately, everything begins accelerating faster than you can process. That word, immediately, appears again and again, shaping the entire rhythm. Because Mark is not writing for people who want long explanations. He is writing for an audience that values action, results, and visible outcomes. Most likely, Romans, people who built an empire through decisive movement. And so Mark adapts the message to match how they think and respond. Instead of proving identity slowly, he shows power through consistent action. Jesus moves, heals, speaks, and transforms situations without unnecessary delay. There is no wasted motion, no filler, no extended pauses in the narrative. And psychologically, that creates a sense of urgency inside the viewer. Because fast pacing reduces distraction and increases emotional engagement significantly. Your brain starts following the momentum instead of questioning every detail. And this is where the deeper contrast begins to emerge clearly. The king introduced before now appears as something completely unexpected. Not a ruler demanding service, but a servant choosing to serve others. That idea would challenge everything a Roman audience believed about power. Because power to them meant control, dominance, and visible superiority over others. But here, power is redefined through humility, sacrifice, and intentional service. And that contradiction creates tension that keeps the viewer mentally engaged. Because when expectations are broken, attention naturally increases without effort. Now here is where the narrative becomes even more honest and raw. The people closest to him do not appear strong or impressive. They misunderstand. They hesitate. They fail at critical moments repeatedly. Even Peter, one of the closest, collapses under pressure when it matters. And instead of hiding that, Mark chooses to highlight it openly. That decision increases credibility because imperfection feels real and relatable. Modern psychology shows vulnerability builds trust faster than polished perfection ever could. And Mark uses that principle long before it was ever studied. Because a flawless story creates distance, but a flawed one creates connection. Now, as the narrative continues moving forward without slowing down, you begin to notice everything is pointing toward a single destination. The cross is not an interruption. It is the intended direction. Every miracle, every moment, every interaction moves steadily toward that outcome. And the pacing reflects that inevitability in a powerful way. Shorter scenes, quicker transitions, constant movement toward a defined conclusion. This structure keeps retention high because the brain anticipates what comes next. And anticipation is one of the strongest drivers of sustained attention. Now, step back and see what Mark has quietly accomplished here. He has taken the same life and presented it as urgent action. He has reshaped the narrative without changing the underlying truth itself. And that proves something critical most people never consciously realize. How a story is told can change how it is received entirely. Because the same truth delivered differently creates completely different reactions. And just as you start adjusting to this faster rhythm of storytelling, the next account shifts everything again in a completely unexpected direction. And just when the speed feels overwhelming, the story suddenly slows down. The Gospel of Luke opens with a completely different tone and intention. It does not rush. It does not jump. It carefully builds credibility. Luke writes like someone who investigated everything before daring to speak. He tells you clearly, this account is ordered, researched, and deeply verified. That alone changes how the audience processes everything that follows next. Because certainty reduces doubt and structure increases trust inside the mind, Luke is not writing from tradition. He is writing from collected testimony. Eyewitnesses, interviews, details, all organized into a coherent narrative flow. And that approach reflects something modern audiences still respond to strongly. People trust stories more when they feel grounded in real investigation. Now here is where the emotional shift begins unfolding slowly. Luke does not focus on kings, power, or dominance like others might. He focuses on people most societies tend to ignore or overlook completely. Shepherds appear at the beginning, not rulers or influential leaders. And that choice signals something deeper about the message being told. This story is not reserved for the elite. It belongs to everyone. And as the narrative continues, that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Good Samaritan appears, redefining who deserves to be called neighbor. A man from a despised group becomes the unexpected hero of compassion. That reversal challenges social assumptions and forces the audience to rethink identity. Because the people we dismiss might be closer to truth than expected. And then comes one of the most powerful emotional moments ever written. The story of a son who wastes everything and returns broken completely. He expects rejection, judgment, distance, and consequences for his actions. But what happens next reverses everything he believes about acceptance. The father runs toward him before he can finish his apology. In that culture, running was undignified, especially for a respected elder. But this father ignores dignity and moves toward restoration instead. That image is not just emotional, it is psychologically transformative, because it replaces fear with grace and distance with immediate connection. Modern behavioral science shows acceptance can reshape identity faster than punishment, and Luke captures that principle in a way that feels timeless and powerful. Now, layer this with another detail that often goes unnoticed completely. Luke consistently highlights women, naming them and showing their active roles. In a culture where they were often invisible, he makes them visible. That decision expands the narrative beyond traditional boundaries and expectations. It communicates inclusion without needing to explain it explicitly to the audience. And at the same time, Luke speaks directly to the poor. Not just spiritually poor, but materially poor, those without resources or status. He acknowledges their reality while offering a promise that feels immediate. And this combination creates a powerful emotional resonance across different audiences. Because people do not just want truth, they want to belong within it. Now, as the story continues moving forward with this deeper emotional focus, you begin to notice it is not just about one life anymore. It is about the beginning of something that extends beyond a single moment. Luke is the only one who continues the story beyond this point. He writes a second volume showing what happens after everything seems finished. That expands the scope from one man to an entire movement growing outward. From a small place to the wider world, from silence to global impact. And that shift introduces a powerful idea most viewers do not expect. This story does not end. It continues through ordinary people over time. Now, pause and consider what that means for you personally. Because if the story continues, then you are not outside of it. You are somewhere within its reach, whether you realize it or not. And just as that realization begins settling into your thinking quietly, the final account arrives and reframes everything at the deepest level possible. And just when you think you understand the story, everything shifts completely. The Gospel of John does not begin where any story normally begins. It does not start with birth, place, or historical setting at all. It begins before time, before matter, before anything you recognize exists. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. That single statement reframes everything you thought you understood before. Because this is no longer about events, it is about identity itself. John is not asking what happened, he is asking who this really is. And the answer he gives is not subtle or open-ended. It is direct, absolute, and impossible to ignore once you hear it. The Word became flesh and entered the human experience completely. God, not distant, not abstract, but present within ordinary human life. Now, here is where the structure becomes even more intentional. John does not list countless miracles like the others might choose. Instead, he selects a small number and calls them signs deliberately, because each one points beyond itself to a deeper, hidden meaning, and they are arranged in a sequence that steadily increases in impact. Water becomes wine, something ordinary transformed into something unexpected instantly. A distant healing shows power not limited by space or physical presence. A man crippled for decades suddenly stands and walks without explanation. Thousands are fed with almost nothing, scarcity replaced with overwhelming abundance. Stormy waters become solid ground as fear turns into quiet control. A man born blind sees for the very first time in life. And then the final sign shifts everything beyond any previous expectation. A dead man walks out of a tomb after 4 days gone. That moment does not just demonstrate power, it defines ultimate authority. Because control over life itself is something no human can claim. And John builds toward that conclusion step by step with precision. Each sign removes another possible explanation until only one remains. This is not coincidence, not illusion, not exaggeration shaped by belief. It is a direct claim about the nature of reality itself. And that creates a psychological tension the viewer cannot easily escape. Because when a claim becomes that absolute, neutrality disappears completely. You cannot simply observe it from a safe intellectual distance anymore. You are forced into a decision whether you are ready or not. Now here is where John moves beyond signs into something even deeper. He records conversations that reveal personal transformation at the individual level. A respected leader is told he must be born again completely. A rejected woman is offered living water that never runs dry. And these moments show something science now continues to confirm repeatedly. Transformation does not begin externally. It begins within the internal identity. Behavior follows belief, and belief follows what you accept as truth. John is not just presenting evidence, he is inviting internal change. Now shift again to one of the most intimate moments recorded. The night before everything collapses, fear begins filling the entire room. And instead of focusing on himself, he comforts those around him. He speaks of peace, of presence, of a future beyond fear. And that reveals something deeper than power or authority alone. It reveals intention, care, and a connection that feels personal. Now step back and observe the entire structure John has created. It begins beyond time and ends with a decision inside the viewer. Everything in between is designed to lead toward that final moment. Because John does not hide his purpose or pretend neutrality, he states clearly, "These things are written so you may believe." In believing, you may have life that extends beyond what you see. Now, pause for a second and consider what that actually means. Because if that claim is true, it changes everything you thought mattered. It reshapes identity, purpose, direction, and the meaning of existence itself. And if it is not true, then it demands to be dismissed entirely. There is no middle ground left for comfortable observation anymore. And just as that realization begins settling into your thinking quietly, the entire picture formed by all 4 accounts comes into full view. Now step back and look at everything you have just seen together. 4 accounts, 4 perspectives, 1 life, and 1 unavoidable conclusion forming. They do not compete. They do not cancel each other out completely. They align, overlap, and expand the picture in a powerful, unified way. Remove one, and something essential immediately disappears from your understanding. Keep all four, and a depth appears no single account could achieve. This is not redundancy, it is intentional design at the highest level. Different angles revealing a reality too large for one voice alone. Now, here is the part most people never fully consider deeply. Each account is shaped by the audience it was written for originally. But the structure still speaks directly into modern psychology today, because humans process truth better when it is layered and repeated. Repetition builds familiarity, and familiarity increases acceptance over time naturally. But variation prevents boredom and keeps attention engaged across longer durations. And this combination is exactly what these four accounts accomplish together. They repeat the same core truth while presenting it through different lenses. That keeps the mind active, comparing, connecting, and processing constantly. And that is one of the strongest drivers of retention ever discovered. Now look again at how each perspective answers a different question. One asks if this is the promised king rooted in ancient history. One asks what he did when people watched him in real time. One asks who he is for those pushed outside society completely. And one asks who he is beyond time, matter, and human limitation. Together they form a framework that covers identity, action, inclusion, and essence. And that framework is not just theological, it is deeply human. Because every person asks those same questions at some point in life. Who has authority? What is real? Where do I belong? What is truth? And that is why this story continues resonating across generations globally. It aligns with questions already present inside the human mind naturally. Now, here is where everything becomes personal, whether you expect it or not. Because this is not just information you can store and ignore later. It is a structure that quietly pushes you toward a response. If you are searching for evidence, one account builds a case clearly. If you need to see action, another shows movement without delay or pause. If you feel excluded, one account brings you directly into the center. And if you are questioning reality itself, one forces a deeper decision. That means no matter where you are, one of these speaks directly. And that is not accidental. It is part of the design itself. Now consider what happens if you engage with only one perspective. You might see truth, but only through a limited and partial lens. You might understand something, but miss the depth behind it entirely. Because truth seen from one angle can still be misunderstood easily. But when multiple angles confirm and expand the same core message, confidence increases, clarity grows, and resistance begins to break down. That is how understanding moves from surface level into deeper conviction. Now step into a broader perspective for just a moment here. Stories shape belief, and belief shapes behavior over time, consistently. And behavior shapes the direction a life ultimately begins moving toward. So the way a story is structured matters more than you think. Because structure determines how long someone stays and how deeply they process. And this structure has held attention for nearly 2,000 years. Not because it is simple, but because it is layered and engaging. Now here is something even more interesting when you look closely. These accounts do not attempt to remove tension or difficult moments. They include failure, confusion, doubt, and misunderstanding openly and honestly. And that honesty increases trust in ways polished stories cannot achieve. Because people recognize authenticity when imperfection is not hidden or edited. Now combine that with the emotional progression built into the narrative. Logic introduces the story. Action accelerates it. Emotion deepens the connection. And then philosophy pushes it into a space that demands reflection. That progression mirrors how the brain processes complex, meaningful information naturally. First understand, then feel, then evaluate, and finally decide internally. And that is exactly where this story leaves you at the end. Not with simple answers, but with a question that requires response. What do you believe after seeing the full picture presented clearly? Because belief is not just intellectual, it influences how you live daily. Now imagine removing that question and ending with neutral information instead. The impact would disappear, and the story would lose its power completely. Because transformation requires tension, and tension requires a decision to resolve. And that is why the final perspective does not allow neutrality at all. It brings everything together and forces the viewer to confront the claim. Now here is where the entire structure reveals its deeper intention. It is not just presenting information, it is guiding a journey carefully. From curiosity to understanding, from understanding to emotion, from emotion to reflection, and from reflection to a personal response that cannot be avoided. That is the full arc hidden inside these four accounts together. Now pause and recognize what has happened during this entire journey. You started with a question about why there are four accounts, and now you are facing a question about what you believe personally. That shift is not accidental. It is the core purpose of the structure. Because information informs, but stories transform when structured intentionally. And this is one of the most effective structures ever recorded historically. Now, here is the final layer most people overlook completely. This story was never meant to stay contained within written pages alone. It was designed to move, spread, and continue through people over time, through different cultures, languages, and generations without losing its core. And that only works because it is built on multiple perspectives. One voice can be dismissed, but multiple aligned voices are harder to ignore. That creates resilience that allows the story to survive and expand. Now consider what that means in a modern context today. In a world full of noise, attention is fragmented and easily lost. But layered narratives still capture attention and hold it effectively, because they engage both logic and emotion at the same time. And when both are engaged, retention and impact increase significantly. That is why this structure still works in modern storytelling today. It aligns with how the human brain processes meaning and relevance. Now everything comes down to one final realization you cannot avoid. You have seen the angles, the evidence, the emotion, and the claim. You have followed the structure from beginning all the way to here. And now, the only thing left is your personal response to it. Because the story does not end when the words stop being spoken. It continues in how you choose to interpret and apply it forward. So the real question is no longer why there are four accounts. The real question is what you will do with what you have seen. And that question will stay with you long after this moment ends. Because once you see the full picture, it is hard to unsee. And once you recognize the design, it is impossible to ignore completely. Which means the story is no longer just something you watched. It has become something you are now part of in some way.